So let's understand a little bit about color correcting these clips. First, with your Lumetri Scopes window open, I want you to right click on it, and there's going to be some different types of scopes that we can turn on or turn off. So I'm going to turn on two of them. My Waveform Luma, if it's already grayed out, that's because it's turned on, and my Vector Scope YUV. So you should see a black and white kind of cloud of pixels, and this little hexagon with colors on it: red, green, blue, magenta, cyan, and yellow. Okay, so we're just going to turn on our Vector Scope YUV and our Waveform Luma. Got it? Now, what do these things mean and what do they do? So this is something that we need to understand. So I'm going to pop over here to my Lumetri color panel, and you should notice it has a bunch of sections that can be toggled open and closed individually. Basic correction, creative, curves, color wheels, etc. So toggle them all closed so we have a good starting point. Now go up to the top and let's toggle open basic correction. So there's a couple things that we can do. Basic correction is all about getting all of our clips to a place of sameness, or at least a place of consistency. So in this case, we notice that like our Belmont shots are vivid, they're bright, they've got dark shadows, they've got bright highlights, they've got lots of color, they really pop on the screen. And then this one is similar, but maybe it doesn't pop quite the same way. Plus some of those shadows are really dark, so we're losing a lot of detail in there. But when we get to this TSU shot, the shadows, would you describe them as dark? No? Would you describe any of the highlights as really bright? Would you describe the color as really vivid? No. So how do we know that? Not just that our monitor is lying to us and what's happening. So this is shot in what's called a RAW format. And when they shoot in a RAW format, what it does is it actually shoots with a lot more detail, a lot more bits allocated to the colors, but it squishes them all towards the center of the contrast range. And as you're going to see in a second, what that lets us do is it lets us really push those colors and make them even more intense or less intense, brighter, darker, so we can really actually change our image a lot when it's shot in this format. When they're shot in a standard, just like regular format, then you got to hope that the colors look good when they come out of the camera, and you can still change them as we will, but it's when we get a nice raw footage like this, the file is usually pretty big. It usually actually requires more computing power to process, but this is a good way to show us what this does. So over in our Lumetri scopes, I'm going to right click on this, and let's turn off the vector scope just for a second so we can visually see our waveform a little easier. We're going to go through and we're going to do two steps. One, we're going to fix the brightness and contrast of each clip so they've got a consistent brightness and contrast. So some clips don't look washed out, while others look bright and beautiful, and others look a little grimy. So we want to make sure that we can adjust these and know what we're doing. So I've got my TSU drone selected here, and we can see this. Here's what the waveform is showing us. From left to right, we see 0 to 100, with 100 being the brightest thing. It's called broadcast white. So the brightest thing possible, the brightest color that or the brightest pixel that your TV could display, and 0, which is broadcast black. Now, has anyone ever watched a movie, maybe on a friend's computer or something that was downloaded illegally? It's been compressed and compressed several times, so it's not the original quality. And you watch, and there's like a dark scene, and it's so dark and muddy, you can just see kind of like little I know none of you have ever done this, but you can see like all the details gone. It's difficult to see. Has anyone ever experienced that? So we're talking about a similar thing. Whenever something is too bright, then we lose detail, and on the screen it will literally just appear as like a bright pixel. Or if anything's too dark, it gets all muddy. We can't really see the details. So in this case, do we have any pixels down here near broadcast black? No, none. In fact, they're all the way up here at 20. That's the darkest thing we can get. How about a broadcast white? Yeah, we can see there's a couple things that are clipping. Well, in that case, here's what we're seeing. From left to, if you were to move left to right across this image, and you took each column of pixels and you ranked them by brightness, this is what you would see. So as you move left to right across the screen, in this very first column, the darkest pixel is about 30. The brightest pixel is about 70 something. There might be one or two up higher, and that'd be like these little white pixels. As you move towards the center, again, most of them are not very dark. Over on this side, there's a little bit more shadow, so we see that there's some that are a little bit darker here. But basically, as you move left to right across this image, this is showing us, okay, the pixels in that column are this bright, this dark. Okay, so here's how we can understand what that does. These light adjustments over here in our basic correction let us affect the brightness or darkness of the pixels. So let's just get this in our head. Grab the exposure. Let me bring this over a little bit so we can see it. I'm going to grab the exposure slider and drag it to the right. What happens to every single pixel? Get brighter. And we can see them all pile up here at the top of the screen. They all just got a lot brighter. What if we pull the exposure to the left? Every pixel gets darker. Now you notice there's still some pixels all the way up here on the white. Why? Here's why. This playhead is over both my logo and my drone shot. And what this is showing me on this scope is always whatever is on the screen. So I only pulled down the pixels on the clip underneath. I didn't pull down any of the pixels on the Tennessee State clip, or the Tennessee State logo, which is pure white. So those are all left alone, but the underlying image we saw we made a lot darker. Now you can double click on this little slider and it'll just reset to 0. Go ahead and double click on it. So exposure either makes all pixels brighter or all pixels darker. This is great in that if you get a clip that looks like this, where everything is too dark, which setting would you adjust? Exposure. If everything is too dark, we would just pull that exposure up and try to spread those a little bit more around from dark to light. Okay, next one, contrast. Grab contrast and see what it does. Drag it all the way to the right and then all the way to the left and watch what happens to those brightness and darkness values. What happens? Can someone explain it to me? Contrast does what? What? Doesn't add more color. It's not changing the color. It's only affecting the brightness. It seems like it's affecting the colors, but it's not, or at least it's not really affecting, that's not what this setting is changing. Yes. So close. The contrast is making, when you drag it to the right, look at what happens to the pixels that are on the brighter end of this spectrum. The brighter pixels get brighter and the darker pixels got darker. If you pull it to the left, the brighter pixels get darker and the darker pixels get brighter. Now look at the image as that's happening. So in other words, if we got an image where everything was right here in the brightness middle, it's going to look like this. Kind of boring, bland. There's no dark shadows. There's no bright highlights. So we could add contrast if we pull that up, because contrast pushes the brights brighter and the darker. Now, it looks like it's adding more color here, but it's not. It's actually just increasing the brightness of some pixels and the darkness of others. So it looks like it has more contrast, which makes our eyes go, oh, okay, the color's a little bit more vivid. Okay? So contrast makes the brights brighter and darks darker, or vice versa, brings it all towards the center. Okay? Let's set that one back to the center. Highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks are similar but not identical. Highlights is going to brighten up the bright parts of the image, or darken only the bright parts of the image. Notice most of these pixels are already on the bright side, so pushing them up just makes the bright parts brighter. Pulling it down makes the bright parts darker. That's the highlights. Shadows does the opposite. Pull those down, the dark parts get darker, but the highlights stay mostly the same. Push the shadows up, and everything becomes blah gray. All the dark parts get really bright. Makes sense? Highlights are the bright ones, shadows are the darker ones. And then there's the whites and blacks, which is the most extreme, the whites, the brightest whites. Sometimes you have an image that looks pretty good, it's pretty well balanced, but you just got to bring down just the brightest whites. So you can do that with your whites slider. If we pull that down, you see that keeps those pixels here in the middle, which I think are these columns, from hitting all the way up at the top. And we could take these blacks and pull those down. There's not a whole lot of like dark blacks in this image. So here's how I would approach fixing this image, or color correcting or color balancing. Number one, I walk in and I say, is there anything that's pure white or pure black in the image? Anything that's supposed to be pure white, like not pure white, but pure brightness, like a light bulb. Is there anything in here that should be pure brightness? I don't see any light bulbs. Yes, Jesse.
I like the other Tennessee State shot, so like the sunshine is really bright.
Yes, so that one would probably be all the way up. If you've got sunshine, it might be all the way up. But we might still want to pull those highlights down to hide that. Okay, in this case though, I don't see anything that should be pure black. There's no caves, there's no like deep dark shadows. So I see though that some of these columns look like they're pushing all the way up at the bright. So I'm gonna take and just bring down the brightest things here. So that's those whites. Pull that down just a hair. And now those are no longer clipping the highlights. Clipping is when there's too much brightness. Now, I'd love for the shadows to be darker. I don't need anything all the way down at 0, but nothing is barely going below 20 here. So the shadows don't look very shadowy. They look pretty light gray. So what would I make? How would I make the shadows darker? Grab which setting? Shadows, and pull it. Yep, pull it left. And that, you should see those shadows getting darker and darker. And let's bring those all down till they're more like around 10. You should notice your image starts to look a lot better. Now, how can you tell? Look at my screen real quick. At the very top of any plugin over here on the right-hand side, there's two settings. One, if you hover over this little circle with its like a backward pointing loop, you can either reset, but of course you lose all your settings. I'm going to undo so I get those back. But if you're ever just playing with it and you're like, I don't think I did, let me just start over. You can just reset. Or if you think you're in a good place, but you want to check your work, on the left side of that, there's an FX. And you'll see if you hover over it, it says toggle this on or off. So you can click that and just compare. What do you think? Compare your work and see what you've done. Do you like it? Yay or nay? Have you improved your image? Improved the contrast? The darks are a little darker, the brights a little brighter? How's yours look? Mine looks better. Now, looking at this though, I might like the bright parts to be a little bit brighter, but I don't want the brightest parts to be brighter. Like these brightest parts are already really close to 100 there. I think that's these little these columns, if I'm guessing. But I do want the overall brightness to kick just a little bit more because most of these are down here at 60. Which would I turn up if I wanted to turn up the brighter parts, but not the brightest parts? Which one of these? Yep, highlights. Highlights is going to push those brighter parts up just a little bit, but it's not pushing up those brightest whites. Now, turn your effects off and on. And you should see that we've gone from a bland, light gray, kind of boring shot to something with contrast, with punch. It looks kind of... Everybody see that okay? So, we've balanced that out. Let's click through a couple of these other clips. Let's go to the first one. This one looks pretty good. We can see detail here in the sky. The shadows are dark, but I can still see detail. Nothing is all the way down at 0. And I can see a nice range of darks to lights. So my image looks pretty good. How about this next one? Ooh, this one might have a little too much. Now, if you want, on this first shot, this I find distracting. Does everybody see how I've got, it's like, oh, wait a minute, I still got something all the way up here at white. What is this? What are these that are all the way up here at pure brightness? It's the logo, because I've got the logos turned on. If you don't want to be distracted by that, we can go to any track. Can you see this? And if you just click on its little eyeball, that'll turn it off for a minute. And then that fixes, now we don't have those creating this kind of distraction. So I'm just going to turn that off just for a second. It hides the track so we don't see it. Now I can assess it without being distracted by those extra pixels that are always too bright. All right, so now my second shot. Does this have any pixels that are too bright? Yeah, these are all the way up at 100. We've got a lot of these, basically these clouds on a big screen. There's no detail in them. Look, there's no detail of fluffiness in the cloud. It's just white, just pure white. So on a big screen, that's going to look like a kind of weird white just tear through the image. So what do I need to do to bring down the overly bright parts? First, I should bring down what? The brightest ones, which is the whites. So if I grab this and I just pull it down a little, I start to get some of that detail back in those clouds. Now I can start to see little shadows and little shapes in the clouds. Nice. Okay, so just bringing that down got me a little bit. It could also bring the highlights down just a little bit. How about the darks? Are the darks too dark? Yes. Yeah, it does seem a little bit dark to me. So is there one slider we could adjust to pull the brights down and the darks up? Contrast. I'm going to actually reset these for a second and see what happens if I just pull the contrast down just a little bit. Even pulling it down just a little evens that out. And it still looks like I got to pull those whites down. Here's how I adjust mine, if you'll look at the screen for a second. When I'm trying to make small adjustments, these sliders are a little clunky because they move in really big chunks. So I usually actually just click on the number, and then the up and down arrow keys will let me move in small increments. If I add command, it'll move it in 1/10 of a dB increments, or 1/10 increments. If I add shift, it moves it 10 at a time. So just click on the number, and I'm just going to bring those highlights down, and then turn my effects off and on. So that's pretty contrasty, but with this on, I've got a bit more even exposure, and I can see the detail in my clouds again. So go through, and I want you to just click through one at a time And we're not looking for perfection. We're just trying to like average this out a little bit so that the clips are not some really bright and contrasty, some really dull and gray. So I might take this one and just push those shadows up a bit. I want the blacks off of 0. I don't want those all the way there. And maybe I'll just push these highlights up a little bit more so I have a nice bright image. There's the original. There's the next one. Here's my Fisk shot. Ooh, definitely have, I'm going to make sure I'm over the part with just the video. Got some that are too bright here. Got a lot that's too dark. Push those blacks up just a little bit. Maybe push these shadows up just a little bit. Brighten that up a hair. And then the brightest whites are too bright. So I'm going to go to the whites and bring those down. And it's a little more consistent. So we're just trying to get it shot to be a little more consistent. And let's bring these highlights down. Good. All right, so take a second, go through. This is just some practice. Bring these shadows up a little bit so they're not quite so harsh and dark. And bring the highlights down just a little bit so that they're not so much higher than the rest. Some of these highlights are way too bright, but let's push those shadows up. Nice. Look at the difference here. Pushing the shadows up on this one. I always thought that this shot looked way too dark in the shadows. So pushing those shadows up lets me actually see these rocks. Here was the original. Looks pretty dark and moody, doesn't it? But now that's a little bit brighter. Maybe a little too bright. Okay, so go through and just try to make a little brightness balance and correction based on these skills. Bring these whites down. Bring the highlights down a little bit. Bring the shadows up just a little bit. And there's no blacks sitting on the bottom, so a little too contrasty, a little more even. Maybe this one will push the shadows up a bit. Nice. All right, take just a second and go through. Try to even those things out. All right, next. The next one, so now that we've balanced out our exposure a little bit with the light part, I'm going to right-click on this, and we're going to balance out our saturation. So right-click, and I'm going to turn on my vector scope, and I'm going to turn off my Luma. Now, this is that Premiere bug again. I just turned on the vector scope, but nothing changed. So whenever that happens, you just have to go down to your timeline and hit play, and then it will suddenly update. It's a bug that's been there for as long as I've been using Premiere. I don't know why. You turn it on, it doesn't show up. But if you click someplace else, then suddenly it'll wake up. All right. So let's walk through, and now we're going to apply an even balance of color intensity or saturation. So right here on my very first clip, I see what I'm seeing here is similar. Instead of the 100 being the brightest white and 0 being the darkest black, what this shows is how intense are the colors in each of these directions. So you can tell that this image under the playhead right now has some red. It has something between blue and cyan. That's going to be the sky. It's got some good energy between green and yellow, so that your trees and your grass and your bricks, etc. So this is showing us how intense the colors are in every direction. If you want to see that, come over here to your white balance, where you see your temperature, tint, and saturation. Grab that saturation slider and drag it all the way to the left. What happens to all the pixels on the vector scope? They move in towards the center on that dot. So when we drag it to the left, all of a sudden the pixels are all still there. They still have the same brightness and saturation, or brightness, but they don't have any saturation. In other words, the color intensity is gone. Take it the other way. Grab that saturation, push it all the way up to 200. And what do you see? It's starting to look like an anime, right? The colors are way super popped, super vivid, all kinds of like bright, and we see that we've got a very saturated image. This image is pushing way closer to the broadcast safe hexagon here, representing you do not want colors to go outside of that. If you have colors that go outside of that, they will start to posterize. In other words, they'll just get rounded to the closest red or magenta or whatever. And then that's when you start to get really blocky looking images. If I were to look for posterization, you can see when you oversaturate colors like this, do you see how they've just been rounded to the closest orange? So it doesn't look like a nice even gradient. Instead, you've just now got colors that are so saturated they're just getting rounded to specific, like whatever the closest green or yellow or orange or whatever is. So we want to avoid that. So we don't want to oversaturate our image. So what we do want, though, is for our shots to be consistent. If we want this level of saturation on every one of our shots, we don't want it to go from bright and vivid and saturated to way less saturated to bland, right? That would look awkward and weird. So what we want to do is figure out how close to this outer edge we want to get and average them out. So maybe on this one, I'm not going to make it this saturated. Let me just pull it back here to where it's about 40% saturated. And that looks pretty good. Then I'm going to go to my next shot and looking at this one, is that as saturated as the previous shot? No, not even close. So on this one, I could pop over here, push that up, saturate it a little bit more, and now they match a little better. Then I could go to my TSU shot. Is it as saturated? No. So I could saturate that a little more, and now these shots are starting to match, starting to look a little bit better. So let's go through and even out the saturation. This one actually looks pretty saturated already. Go to this next one, maybe saturate that a hair. That one's pretty well saturated already. So we're evening these things out. Some of these, and this one's a little dim, a little dull. That one's a little bit unsaturated too. Boom. So now we've just evened out that saturation, and now that video is really starting to look pretty good. Balanced out shot to shot. Color's looking better. Jump on from there. Okay, so once you have balanced out the exposure and we've balanced out the color saturation, we would also go through and we would do a check for color casts. And that's where some might have, if they were not white balanced correctly, they might have a blue tint or a red tint or just a tint to the footage that we'd have to fix. Now, none of these have that, and we'll explore that more in later projects. But this was our introduction to color correction. All right, now the next step in the instructions. Next step in the instructions says, add an adjustment layer over the entire video and apply a creative look from the available filters. So I'm going to use my tilde key so that this is nice and big. Actually, let's see, I need to come over to my project window. So Shift 1 will take you to your project window. Shift 1 takes me to the project window. And it has to be big enough for you to see this. If you've got the window too small, look at my screen. You'll notice down at the bottom, I can't see all my buttons. So you do have to make sure that this window is big enough. That's why I reset. But in the bottom right corner of your project window, I'm going to click on that new icon and do another adjustment layer, just like we did with our blur adjustment layer. So click on the new item icon, click on adjustment layer, tell it OK. And then I'm going to give this a new name. You can see I've got both classes in here. I'm going to call this Creative Look Adjustment Layer. I've got one already for the other class I was demoing. That's why I have two. Anyone remind me what an adjustment layer is or does?
It applies the effects to everything below it.
You got it. So and it's an empty clip. So like this blur adjustment layer that we made, we put it in here. It's an empty clip. We can put whatever effects on it that we want, and anything that's below it will be affected by those clips. But only as long as that adjustment layer is above it. So it's like we're looking down through it, and any effects that are on it affect what everything else below it looks like. It's like a pane of glass. The more paint or things we put on it, anything we see through it is going to be. All right, so now that creative look adjustment layer, here's the deal. When you're using Instagram or any of these other things that let you use a filter, you throw the filter on and it just affects the whole image, right? So in this case, what I want to do, I'm going to use my tilde key to blow this up. Can anyone remind me of the shortcut to make our tracks taller and smaller? Shift plus and minus, right? So let's make our tracks smaller. So I have some empty space up here, and I'm just going to drag that creative look adjustment layer to the beginning and up at the very top track. So put it all the way at the top.
Would that be creating a new track?
You don't have to, but actually I'm doing this for a purpose, so I want you to see this. So this creative look adjustment layer, I'm going to shift plus there tall again. Problem is, when I dropped it into my top track, you notice eventually it would run into that moon taxi graphic that I've got there. So how do I move clips up and down? What shortcut moves a clip up and down between tracks? Option, up and down arrows. So if you're already at the top track, Option up arrow will just make you a new track. It'll automatically do it. You don't even have to mess with it. So now I'm going to trim that out until it's over the whole video. So we're going to apply our filter that we want, our creative look filter, to this adjustment layer, and everything that happens beneath it will then get that creative look. So we just drag that adjustment layer out over the whole thing. Shift minus to make this small again. Now select your creative look adjustment layer, and let's go look at a different section of our Lumetri color panel. You can toggle the basic correction closed. So when you toggle the basic correction closed, you'll see other options: creative, curves, things that we'll go into in later classes. But go to your creative section, and I'm going to turn back on my logo layer so it's not missing. So if you still have your logo layer turned off or any of these eyeballs hiding things, make sure all your tracks are visible, because I want to see what the whole thing's going to look like. Okay, so right here it is. I'm going to come to my creative section, and underneath these looks, you can either click and choose from the drop down, or you can just click on these little arrows and go left and right, and you'll see what that effect, you get a little preview of what that's going to look like. So you can go through and find an Instagram filter. Maybe I like this one, this Kodak 52018. I press that, and that it's applied to the adjustment layer, and now it's applied to this whole track. If I don't like it, I can keep looking. I can try that one. Interesting. How about this one? So these are all sorts of different film stock emulations. So you can get different sort of looks and feels. But some of them look, especially when I get over our pictures, they're way too contrasty. So I'm probably going to go look for a look that is not quite that extreme. Oh, I like that one. There. Kind of filtery. I might come down here and make it a little less intense. Maybe give it a faded film sort of thing. I don't like faded film. How about the vibrance? Let's make the vibrance maybe a little more saturation. We don't need more saturation. We've already adjusted those. And again, you can click this little box right beside that to turn it off and on. And you can see what a difference it makes. I think I like it. So go through and pick a filter to apply to your adjustment layer. So once you've got your creative look dialed in, if you want, you can go ahead and grab a screenshot, because if you look at the instructions, you'll see the instructions at the bottom. They say your Lumetri color panel showing your creative look adjustments is one of them. And here you can see I've got the creative look selected. There's the creative look. I've got the adjustment layer. So there's a screenshot of the whole thing. So if you want to just grab that right now while you're at it, go ahead, because you'll need to turn that in. Yep, Shift Command 3 will capture your whole screen. All right, the last few things we need to do to this project to wrap up are we need to make sure that we've got some nice little fade ins and outs, and that our clips all start and end at the same time. So let's take a peek at this. I'm going to zoom mine up really big so that everybody can see it. And I'm just going to look through and make sure that my clips are starting and ending together. What we don't want is we don't want this Rock the Vote logo being a little longer here, this one a little shorter here, right? Watch what this looks like when that happens. If we've got some that are a little bit farther and a little bit shorter, watch what this looks like on the screen.
Diversity. We're Nashville.
Do you see that? Watch.
Diversity.
Bump, something changes in the back, that changes, then that changes, right? It just looks awkward. So we don't want our shots changing at different times. The blur disappeared 1 frame early, then the image changed 2 frames later, then our graphic went away. So we want to make sure those things are starting and ending together. So I'm going to zoom through, and I'm just going to trim these and take a look at my screen. You might notice if you're trying to trim these things and they're not trimming together, or there's no like assistance, and you have to just zoom in a whole lot, make sure that you come up and you turn on this magnet or snap in timeline. It's done with the S key, because then when you go to trim them, you'll feel a little snap as it snaps to the closest edge. So I'm going to scroll through and make sure I don't have some things ending a little longer or a little shorter. I want to trim them all to where they're starting and ending consistently wherever those are at. So go through, scroll through yours, Shift plus so things are nice and big. Just scroll through and make sure you don't have things starting and ending at different times, or at least if you've got a chunk of things starting together, that they're ending together, etc. So I'm just double checking all my work here. Here's a little keyframe that was not quite right. Okay, and that's looking good. Oops, over here at the end, everything's not quite ending at the same time, so I'm going to do that. This voiceover technically ends early, so that's okay. All right, so we're going to do a quick pass, double checking that our in-points, out-points, etc., that our clips are starting and ending together, so we don't have anything flashing on the screen or changing. All right, to wrap this one up, and then that'll still leave y'all with a few minutes to go through and check, but we want to make sure our video does not end abruptly. So if I'm playing through this and she says her last words.
And now, a few words from Belmont President Bob Fisher.
Wow, Bob's not president anymore. Hasn't been for a while. Okay, it just kind of ends. So we don't want that. What I do want to do is I'm going to come into the ends of my clips and do 2 things. We already know how to create a little dissolve, add the default transition to the end of our clips. How do we do that? The default transition is Command D. So I'm going to select each of these, And let's maybe start that fade right after her words end. So I'm just going to trim these so that when she stops talking, that all those video clips start transitioning out. So I'm going to make sure that those just all start at the same time. And then look at my screen. Do you remember when we were taking our blurs and we used their keyframe line to adjust what? On our blur adjustment layers, this keyframe line was adjusting the what? Does anyone remember? When we added those points? The opacity. So it made it more visible or less visible. So it made each clip. On our audio clips, we have the same keyframe line, but it doesn't change the opacity, it changes the volume. So if I hover my mouse over, look at my screen so you can see it. Okay, so you see right now it says the volume of this clip is what? Volume is at level 0, so it's not turned up, it's not turned down. So if I hold down which modifier key, I get my plus button to add my keyframes. Command, so if I hold my command key down, I can click to add a keyframe there. I can click to add a keyframe at the end. And you notice now, when I pull this down, do you see how? It says it's turning it down, -40, -90, -999 decibels. And that means the volume is going to go from gain all the way down to -infinity. So now you'll hear it fade out as that audio fades away.
Few words from Belmont President Bob Fisher.
Okay, how do we do it every time? You hover over your keyframe line. You've got 4 modifier keys. Try all 4 of them until one of them gives you a plus. Cool, which one was it? Command, yeah. So that one, add a couple of lines, and then now it'll just fade down. We just want it at the end, so now the video should end looking something a little more like this.
Belmont President Bob Fisher.
The music fades out, the video's fading out, everything fades away at the same time. Huh?
How do you get the thing to draft?
All right, we're going to run through this last step here on the project, and that is, it says we need to export a final media file where it's going to render the whole thing into a single video clip that we could upload to YouTube or whatever we wanted. We're going to export it with these settings. Format, H.264, preset, we're going to choose match source, adaptive high bitrate, and output name, 1450 last name, first name, Premiere Project. We've already checked that all of our edits are clean. We want to make sure that there's nothing out of sync or messed up. And then there's a list of screenshots. So your required screenshots, I even gave you visuals for what that would look like. So zoom out so I can see the whole screen, reset your editing workspace, reset it to the save layout, and reset all the tracks so I can see all your audio and video tracks. Everybody see that right here? Okay, so it may not look identical to this, but it's going to look pretty much like this. Your clips might be a little earlier or later, but it should have all of those elements. Your common media folder showing your file management. So there's the common media folder. I didn't open up every single folder, but I at least have it open so I can see what's in my Capture Scratch, my project files, etc. Then it says your Lumetri color, showing your creative look. So I selected my adjustment layer where we put the creative look, and I brought that up. So I can quickly see that you applied the creative look. And then finally, we needed the select your voiceover track and open the essential sound window. So under the essential sound window, I should be able to see that you followed the steps and you've got that voiceover preset selected. And then you need to also upload the actual .pr project file. So once it's final, saved, and done, because that would let me download your project file and open it up, relink it with all my own media files, and if I needed to verify that you did or didn't do something, I could just see it that way. But let's go ahead and export the file, this final media file, with these settings. So over here in Premiere, we started in the import window, then we've been editing for a week or two in the edit window, and then we can finally click over to the export window right here at the top, and this will let us choose all of those settings. So first, let's give it the right name. 1450-last name-first name-premiere-project. Then, where do we want to save it? Well, I'm going to click here and tell it where to save. I'm going to click on this. It's going to say where. I'm going to navigate to my project, open that up, and which of these folders should I save my final exported file in? Final exported files. So I'm going to choose that. There's already one from the last class, but that's okay. I'm going to choose save anyway. And it's going to say, hey, that'll replace it. That's okay in this case. And then preset, what preset do the instructions say? Match the source, meaning what it's saying is, don't make it larger, don't make it smaller, don't make it 4K. It's saying whatever we started with, if this video is 1280 by 720, if it's whatever size it is, match that source. Keep it the way it is. And the adaptive high bit rate means give it lots of ones and zeros, a high bit rate, so we keep as much quality as possible. Adaptive means the parts of the video that are more complex with more detail, give that more ones and zeros. If you have a couple shots that don't move or don't change that much, give those less ones and zeros, and it actually doesn't keep information for every frame if nothing changes. So adaptive high bitrate is going to be that choice, and the format says H.264, which is the most common video file format type on Earth. Okay, so we named it correctly, we put it in our exported folders, we chose the presets, but here's the thing that I see people mess up. Down here at the bottom, it says export the entire source. And we can actually see if we hit play, we can scroll through and watch the whole video. And right here it shows us how big that is. So how long is this video that we're about to export? 51 seconds, okay? So just under a minute, but I can play it, looks great. So I could literally just go right now and hit export, and that would be good to go. So it'll export it, and it'll put it back in my folder, right here in Final Exported Files. It's making it right now. But here's what I see happen where people accidentally mess things up. Some people will get to editing, and they'll drop all their clips on the timeline first. Usually this is an inexperienced editor. They'll drop all the clips that they're trying to edit on their timeline, and as a result, and then they'll just go through cutting stuff out and leaving like less and less on the timeline until they're just back to the video. But that a lot of times still leaves some tiny little piece or automation or keyframe way out later. So if I go to export right now, even if I think that I'm just working on this, when I go to export, if I have this set to entire source, how long is the video going to be when it exports? 7 minutes and 19 seconds. And if I scroll through it, I'm going to see the video actually stops right there, and then there's 6 minutes of black screen. So that's not what I want. So how do I avoid it? Typically, when I'm exporting, I go to the end of my video, I set an out, which is done with O, and then when I export, I don't say do the entire thing, because I sometimes have clips way off later in the timeline too. I say don't do the entire source, just do in to out. And you can see that's only going to do wherever your in and out points are set. If you scroll through that, you see that is your video, after which it's just black. So setting your in and out point, now I can export. Let me make sure I actually chose the right settings, because I don't think it kept my settings. Adam Nathan, Premiere Project. Okay, it's going to the Final Exported Files. It has the correct settings. It's only doing my video. I'm going to make sure, and yes, I'm going to replace, because I already have one in there. If you don't have an in and out point set, when you set the out point, it automatically assumes the beginning of the video is the in point. So when I hit O right there, it said, oh, okay, I don't know when else I would put it, so it just starts at the beginning of the video. Good question. If you had set an in point somewhere here in the middle, it automatically sets an out point at the end of the latest clip. So that's why I started by setting an out point. And here is the video that I exported.
Welcome to Rock the Vote at Belmont
Looks
University, where Nashville
Footage looks
colleges
great.
are uniting
Everything's
to
balanced
celebrate
well.
democracy. With performance from
Look
Tennessee
at that.
State
Looks so
University,
much better than that
spoken
bland
word
gray
artist
shot that it
Summer
had.
Jade, from Middle Tennessee State University, Shelter Cove.
Yeah. All right, questions about this? So does everyone feel like they're confident in exporting and in getting this specific list of screenshots and uploading all those? All right, I'm going to go and open up this project upload. This is due before next class. And next class, let's see, 2/7. There we go. And I'm going to make that visible. So take the last couple minutes. If you're already close to wrapping it up, you should be able to export and upload. Otherwise, raise your hand and I'll come around and give you help.